Hello, UND community. It's Sonia, your health promotion coordinator, and we're back today making a healthy pumpkin bread. I personally like to make this when I want to have breakfast ready for a few weeks, actually, just because I make enough to last me about 2.5 weeks. It's a great grab and go option. You can make it, you can have some that you keep out, but then I like to actually cut the rest up into squares about the size of a brownie, stick them in my freezer in their own individual Ziploc bags, and then just grab them and go on my way out as I'm headed to work in the morning. I know right now we're not headed to work, we're all kind of in quarantine still, but it's just a great option to have even here. And it's really healthy, it's full of heart-healthy fats, it's a very nutrient-dense option, and it pairs well with a good piece of fruit. So before we get started, I'm gonna go ahead and take you through our ingredients for the day. We're gonna start off with our flour. I'm using whole wheat flour today. When possible, it's great to use whole wheat flour as an option. I understand that right now you might not have that in your cupboard. If that's the case, feel free to use what you have. If you are gluten-free, feel free to substitute it out with a flour that works well for you. I know they have a lot of different options like coconut and almond flour, oat flour. I personally have never made this recipe using one of those flours, but you have to do what works best for you and your stomach and your GI tract. So by all means, if you need to use a gluten-free flour, you can. I then have pure vanilla extract that I'm using. I always recommend buying pure vanilla extract. I know some people are fine with using imitation, but when possible, I really recommend buying pure vanilla extract. It just has that flavor and it helps bring out the other flavors in the recipe. I'll be using a little bit of cinnamon. Again, that's just a flavor enhancer. I always like to put about a 6-ounce serving, so around a half a cup of non-dairy yogurt, or if you have Greek yogurt, you can use that. Today I am using oat milk yogurt in my bread. I have some nutmeg. Again, that's for flavor. Obviously, the star of this recipe, our pumpkin. I'm just using canned pumpkin. I got this. It was literally like 70 cents at the grocery store. So I just look to make sure that there's nothing else added in it. And then after that, I go for the price and I compare nutrition labels. Instead of sugar, I will be using honey. We are using honey. They say to use about a 1/2 to 2/3 cup of honey for every cup of sugar. I kind of tend to hover around that 1/2 cup mark. I will be adding some craisins in here. I chose the ones with less sugar. When possible, I just try to aim for that option. These are kind of for a little bit of added bulk in the bread and some extra fiber. Then I have 2 eggs that I will be using. I also like to give myself a little bit of a treat with these, so I'll be using around a cup of semi-sweet chocolate chips and then a cup of chopped walnuts. You could buy whole walnuts too, or kind of any other nut that you think would work well in this. It's up to you. I like the chopped walnuts just because it's easy. They're already cut for me and I can throw it in there. And then instead of butter, I will be using extra virgin olive oil. So the conversion for that is a 1/2 cup plus 1 tablespoon of olive oil for 1.5 sticks of butter. And the original recipe called for 1.5 sticks of butter. Also, you can see in my background, I'm just going to call it out now, it's laundry day, so you see my laundry hanging in the background. Utensils for this recipe, you need a large baking sheet. You can use, this is a 9 by 13 inch one, so mine doesn't really end up in a bread form, but rather kind of more flat like brownies, and I cut them up as I mentioned earlier. I use a brush just to kind of help. I always put a little bit of olive oil down on the pan and then up around the edges, and you'll see me doing it later. I just do that to help make sure that the bread doesn't stick, and so I use the brush just to spread it. A wooden spoon to mix things together. I don't have a mixer. If you have a mixer, that's a great option. Feel free to use it. I have my cup, my 1/2 cup, and then a teaspoon, measuring spoon. And then I'll be mixing everything in this large bowl here. So I forgot to mention our liquid measuring cup so that way we can measure the olive oil in here. We're gonna start off by preheating our oven. I like to preheat my oven to 350 degrees. It'll get done preheating before I'm done actually prepping this meal. So Depending on how quick you are, you can choose to kind of preheat your oven in the middle of your prepping everything, so that way it's not on for as long, but I'm just gonna go ahead and turn it on now so that way I don't forget. Here we are, bake, 350, start. We are preheating and you'll hear the beep beep when it's ready and it's done preheating. All right, so before you begin cooking, you're gonna wanna make sure that you wash your hands for a minimum of 20 seconds using warm soapy water. I went ahead and did that already, so I'm not gonna show you myself washing my hands today, but I just wanna emphasize that this is good practice, whether we're in the middle of a pandemic or not. It's really good practice to do, especially if you are handling both raw meat and produce like vegetables or fruit. That way you help avoid cross-contamination. It's also good practice just during the middle of the school year or the middle of the year, so that way you're not putting other people's germs in your mouth and you help prevent the spread of germs, thus reducing your chances of getting sick. Okay, so some people when they bake like to have two separate bowls, one where they mix in their dry ingredients, then one where they mix their wet ingredients and then add everything together. I like to use as few kitchen utensils as possible just because it helps cut down on the cleanup time at the end. So I start by combining all my wet ingredients first, and then I move into my dry ingredients. I also find that since I don't have a mixer, it just makes the mixing process a lot easier to start by getting all my wet ingredients or liquid ingredients mixed together first, and then add the dry ingredients afterwards. So we're gonna start. I went ahead and I opened up my can of pumpkin using a can opener. We're gonna go ahead and just start by dumping that into your bowl. And it is really in there, so it might actually help to get a metal spoon to help get it out. So I have my metal spoon, it'll just help me scoop it out. So pumpkin is actually a fall/winter squash. I really like it for cooking things like breads and muffins. It's very high in fiber, and if you make sure that your canned product doesn't have anything other than pumpkin in it, you're really just actually getting the pumpkin. You're not getting added sugar or salt. So that's always a plus. Pumpkin, and you might know this from its nice orange color, but it is high in beta carotene, just like carrots. Beta carotene is known for helping with eye health. And then it's also a good source of vitamin A. Vitamin A helps fight off infections. So the beta carotene in pumpkin gets converted to vitamin A, and so that helps with your body's ability to fight infection. So I'm just going ahead and scraping it all out of here. And fun fact, if you have a dog, pumpkin is actually okay for dogs to eat. So it's a dog safe food. You don't have to worry about them if they get a hold of it being dangerous for them. Next we're gonna go ahead and add our yogurt into the bowl with the pumpkin. I am using oat yogurt and we're using a 1/2 cup, so I'm just gonna scoop it up with the 1/2 cup measuring cup. Oat yogurt is a really good option for people who are lactose free. That way it doesn't bother their GI tract, and they can go ahead and have yogurt. The nice thing about this yogurt is it does have the live non-dairy yogurt cultures like S. thermophilus and L. bulgaricus in it, which do help with gut health overall. So I'm just gonna shake out the rest of that. So some recipes, when you're making this, instead of yogurt, they might ask for milk. And that just depends. If you don't have milk in your house, the yogurt is a great option. The nice thing about the yogurt that I was using is it was only 100 calories per serving, and that 1/2 cup is a serving. And it has 6 grams of protein and 1.5 grams of fat. So it's actually not a bad option for somebody that likes it or that is lactose intolerant. So I'm just mixing together right now my yogurt and pumpkin puree. Some people like to wait until everything is in before mixing it. But I kind of like to mix things as I go. Do be careful because I am noticing that it is very easy to splash outside of the bowl, and we don't want you to be losing half of your batter. So I will be mixing a little slower. If you are using a mixer, I recommend starting off on the lower setting. If you start off right off the bat in a really quick setting, you're probably gonna get liquid all over your house or your wall. So we obviously want to save time on cleanup, not add more to our cleanup. Okay, so now that I've mixed together for the most part my yogurt and pumpkin, you can see that it changed a little bit in color. It's more of a very light orange. I'm gonna go ahead and add in my vanilla, and so I am using 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. This was actually brand new, so I get to open it and use it for the first time for this recipe. That's always exciting, getting to use like new fresh ingredients. So 1 teaspoon of vanilla. All right, so I put it in there, and then I'm gonna go ahead and mix that in too. I love the smell of pure vanilla extract. It really helps add to that warm, homey feeling that you get when you're baking something. All right, so now that that's mixed in, I'm going to go ahead and add in a 1/2 cup of olive oil. And so a lot of people will end up using their regular like dry measuring cups when they're measuring, basically whether they're measuring flour or whether they're measuring like water, milk, olive oil. But there are 2 separate measuring cups. So this traditional measuring cup that we all see is for dry ingredients, and this is for wet ingredients. Well, I've had friends that are like, it doesn't really make a difference, like a cup is a cup or a 1/2 cup is a 1/2 cup. I always like to follow using this measuring cup for wet ingredients and this type of measuring cup for dry ingredients. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and use this measuring cup for my olive oil. Knowing that the original recipe called for 1½ sticks of butter, we're gonna substitute that. The conversion is 1/2 cup plus 1 tablespoon for 1½ sticks of butter. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour myself 1½ cups, and this might take, or 1/2 cup. Ooh, not 1½ cups. 1/2 cup. This might take a little bit. Okay. What I want to show you is when you are measuring liquids, you want to look for, I just shook the cup, but you want to see where the meniscus is, so kind of where the dip is, and that's the 1/2 cup should be right at the dip. So this is a perfect amount of olive oil. We're going to go ahead and add that in here. Shake it out. And then I'm gonna go ahead and get my tablespoon. I did not take that out earlier, so I have to get that to add the 1 tablespoon of olive oil. Before I get that 1 tablespoon, there's the oven, it's done preheating. I told you I'm not very quick at this, but I didn't want to forget it. So I'm just gonna mix in the olive oil right now. All right, so I got my tablespoon out, and I'm gonna go ahead and add in that 1 tablespoon of olive oil too. So at this point, I am gonna take some time to really mix it well together. You'll know that it's mixed in well when the olive oil no longer kind of forms a border along the bowl with the pumpkin. So really mix that in, get it good. So you can see it's very well mixed. You don't see pockets of olive oil like along the side of the bowl. All right, so if you don't have more than 1 set of measuring cups and measuring spoons, you might need to wash them halfway through, just because we already used this for the yogurt and I didn't want to just add the honey straight in it. And then we used this for the vanilla extract, the teaspoon, and we're gonna need it for the cinnamon and nutmeg. So when you are using honey in place of sugar, which is a good option for people if that's the way they want to go, and that's how I'm going today, you substitute a 1/2 cup to 2/3 cups of honey for every cup of sugar. And so the original recipe actually called for 2 cups of sugar, and so I'll be using 1 cup of honey. So I could have used my 1 cup, but I wanted to keep that clean for the flour, so I'm just gonna fill up my 1/2 cup twice. One trick, since honey is really sticky and it would end up just getting really stuck to the inside of the measuring cup, and I'd spend more time trying to get it out than what it was actually worth, it's actually okay to line your measuring cup with just a little bit of olive oil and then really spread that around. So that way when you actually pour the honey in and then you go to pour it into your mixture, it'll just glide right out. So you really only need a drop. We'll see if we can catch it here. Oh, that was probably just a tad bit much. It's not a big deal if you have a little much. And then I just tend to swirl it around so that it really coats the inside of the cup. If any of it falls out, I like to swirl it over my batter, like my mixture, so that way it'll just land in there rather than landing on my counter and making a big mess. All right, so you can see the inside of my cup is well coated, and I'm gonna go ahead and start pouring honey in here to measure it out. So to just get the honey out of your jar, you can just use a spoon. If you have the squeeze honey, you'll just squeeze it into your cup. But I like to use raw honey, and that's something I recommend that everybody look for when they're in the grocery store, to make sure that their honey says that it's raw. That just means that it's been the least processed, and so it'll have more health benefits for you. All right, so here's 1/2 cup of honey. It's filled, and then watch how easily it glides out with the olive oil. Woo, look at that. So this is my first 1/2 cup, and since the original recipe called for 2 cups of sugar, I will be using 1 full cup of honey. I personally like using honey in recipes if I can substitute it for sugar. Obviously there's some recipes where you really should just be using sugar if the recipe calls for it, but I just like honey because it's a natural form of sugar. It's something that I tend to have in my house all the time. I actually never not have at least 1 jar of honey in my house. So I like it, and then I like the fact that if you buy local raw honey, it even helps with things like allergies. And so it just has some of those immune boosting antibacterial properties to it. So if you can see, this is what the inside of my cup looks like. It's basically clean. There's a little bit of honey left, which will just come out in the next round when I pour in my next 1/2 cup of honey. If you were using sugar for this recipe, you would want to put the sugar in with the dry ingredients. So that is a difference to consider. Honey does become a wet ingredient because it is liquidy, where sugar, you would mix that in with your flour, and then your spices too. All right, so here's my second 1/2 cup of honey, and I'm just gonna go ahead and pour it in. And then I always like to begin stirring together as I'm pouring it in, just so that way it mixes well. So I'm just mixing it together. It might seem pretty runny right now, but it'll thicken up really quickly as soon as we begin mixing the dry ingredients in and we add that flour. Final 2 items we're gonna add to the liquid mixture right now are our eggs. You can use any eggs, white, brown, it doesn't matter because they're all the same on the inside. I personally, when I shop, I like to try to buy local eggs. And part of that is just to try to support the local farmers when possible. So you're gonna go ahead and I just crack my egg on the side of the bowl. Be careful not to lose any shells. If you do lose a shell in your mixture, you don't have to worry. I know a lot of people will try to fish it out with their hands or their fingers, and that just becomes more complicated than anything else. You can actually use the back of the eggshell, so like this part of it, and it'll attract, almost like a magnet, it'll attract the shell that fell into your bowl. So before I continue mixing, I am gonna go ahead and wash my hands just because I did crack open raw eggs and I do have some raw egg on me and I don't want to get salmonella and spread that. You shouldn't eat raw batter anyway, but I don't want to touch bowls or other ingredients that I'm going to put away afterwards. 2 eggs are in the bowl and we're just going to go ahead and mix them together. If you have a whisk, you can choose to whisk them together. A mixer obviously would do this a lot quicker, a lot faster, but the wooden spoon method works great and it ends up breaking up. It just takes a little bit longer, but your egg will break up and become part of the liquid mixture. You can see it already beginning to break. I mentioned earlier, I know a lot of people eat raw dough and it doesn't seem to faze them, but I do recommend, just from a health safety perspective, you should never eat raw cookie dough, whether you buy organic or non-organic eggs. It's just not good practice because you still can get sick. And especially right now with COVID-19 going on, the last thing you want is to have salmonella on top of it. All right, time to start adding the dry ingredients. So everything has been mixed really well in the wet ingredient section. This is what it looks like through the bowl. So we're gonna start off by adding 2 cups of flour. So again, I mentioned when possible, try to use whole wheat flour. If you don't have whole wheat flour and all you have is white flour, that's fine too. I don't expect you to go out and buy a whole new set or a whole new bag of flour just for this recipe. So I'm just gonna go ahead, in order to measure it out, some people like to sift their flour for this recipe. You don't need to sift your flour. I kind of just take my measuring cup and stick it in my bag and scoop out my flour. Part of the reason I try to use whole wheat flour is just because the grain hasn't been stripped when you buy any whole wheat products. And so to know that you're... All right, so I've measured 1 cup of flour. I'm gonna go ahead and pour that in. And just so that way I'm not then struggling to stir a really thick mixture, I always try to stir a little bit in as I go. So that way I dump a cup of flour, I mix it together. When you are mixing your flour, especially by hand, you want to make sure that you don't leave any clumps of flour, because flour will clump together, especially when it hits a liquid. So really get those clumps good. I can already feel it. I mean, it's not thickening up to the point that I can't stir, but I can already feel it thickening up, which is a good sign for us. We would not want this to be runny because it would not form a bread. It'd be more of a soup. So I'm gonna go ahead and mix it. I'll show you the clumps. So see how we have clumps here? You just really wanna stir it well. A machine would help you get this done a lot faster, but I don't have the machine, so again, I'm just doing it by hand. And then any flour that you have on the back of your spoon, you can then just kind of wipe it off in there or shake it off and it'll fall off on its own. So I'm gonna go ahead, stir this, and then add my 2nd cup of flour, and I will show you what the thickened product looks like. So we have our mixture. It's thicker now. This might seem still runny for some people, and it is a little bit runny, but when we add our walnuts and our craisins and chocolate chips in, it does thicken up quite a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and add 2 teaspoons of baking soda. Baking soda just helps the product rise. So we have our teaspoon right here. And I'm using the Target brand baking soda. You can use basically whatever brand you have. And there's 1 teaspoon, dump it in. 2 teaspoons, and dump that in. All right, and actually we're gonna need the teaspoon again. The rule of thumb is that for every cup of flour you use, you should use 1 teaspoon of baking soda just to help the product rise quicker. If you were stirring and you found that you still had clumps or you feel like the baking soda clump, you can go ahead and get a whisk to help you break that down. All right, and now I'm gonna go ahead and add 2 teaspoons of ground nutmeg and 2 teaspoons of ground cinnamon. So I'm gonna start with the nutmeg. So there's 1 teaspoon. 2 teaspoons. Some people have also done this recipe and used pumpkin spice instead. If you don't have pumpkin spice, you can kind of use a mix of nutmeg and cinnamon instead, or like even ground clove in there. I don't have pumpkin spice right now, and I don't think it's worth going out to the grocery store just to get it, so the nutmeg will do. Again, if that began to clump, a whisk here could also be helpful, but I'm doing okay breaking it up. And then our 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. So there's actually 2 different types of cinnamon. There's cinnamon that we tend to buy in the grocery store, and then Ceylon cinnamon, which is your true cinnamon. That's what they refer to it as. Cinnamon actually dates all the way back to ancient Egypt. It used to be given as gifts because it was seen as fit for a king. So if your teaspoon, if the hole in your container is not big enough to stick your teaspoon in, you can go ahead and actually measure it out by using like 4 1/4 teaspoons or 2 1/2 teaspoons, but I went ahead and just used 1 big teaspoon. I like adding cinnamon to a lot of different meals. I put it in my oatmeal. I like cooking with it too. Sometimes the cinnamon flavor itself actually disappears, but it helps bring out the flavor of whatever you're cooking. So some recipes actually will use cinnamon when they're cooking with red meat, just because it helps bring out the flavor of all the other spices that you have in there. All right. So now that this is all mixed together, I'm gonna go ahead and add my chopped walnuts and my semi-sweet chocolate chips. If you have dark chocolate chips, you can use those. Even if you have milk chocolate chips, those will probably melt a little bit more and they don't have all of the health benefits, but you could still use that too. If you have a nut allergy, feel free to swap out the chopped walnuts for anything else that you might want to add in here. I personally, I don't have one, so that's why I'm choosing to use it, but you can omit it or change it out for something else. So I'm just gonna measure a cup of chopped walnuts. And if you're only adding like just craisins or just walnuts, you could add a little bit more than a cup. You don't have to limit it. So here's my cup of walnuts. Dump that in, mix that together. If you don't have canned pumpkin in your house, you can also make this recipe but swap out the canned pumpkin for apples. When I do that, I tend to cut 2 to 3 apples depending on the size of the apple. So really it's up to you and really what you have in your own house. All right, craisins. I mentioned earlier I aim to get the ones that have less sugar in them. Craisins are actually just dried cranberries. I like them better than raisins. I like eating craisins in my salad. Actually, craisins and chopped walnuts do go really nicely in like a dark green leafy salad with like a little bit of blue cheese and a nice balsamic vinaigrette. Looks like we have just about a cup of craisins in here anyway, so add those in. If you didn't have craisins and you had raisins or you liked raisins better, by all means go for it and use those too. I just like getting ones with less sugar because I don't want to add that much sugar into this. So now we're going to add our cup. These are semi-sweet chocolate chips. You can use any brand. I just chose what was on sale at the grocery store. And this is about exactly 1 cup too. So no more, no less. And we can add those in. Go ahead and mix that together. This is what our final batter looks like in the bowl. I'm gonna go ahead and grease the pan so that way we can stick it in the oven. So I'm gonna grease my pan using olive oil. So you just pour a tad bit, and then basically as if you were back in elementary school painting, you just take your brush and paint the bottom of the pan. I always like to start off with a little, and then if I need more olive oil as I go, I'll just add more. And then I brush up on the sides because the bread will rise. Even though these end up becoming more like brownies, they still rise on the sides, and I don't want it to stick there. So fun fact about the brush, you can find brushes that have silicone bristles like this one, or you can get brushes that have hair bristles, so literally it looks like a paintbrush. I personally like the ones with silicone because that way you won't lose any strands of quote-unquote hair from the brush and have that end up in your food that you're cooking. You would see if one of these fell off. All right, so this is done and polished, and we're ready to pour our batter into here. Ready? So I just pour it over. If you have 2 people in your house, 1 person can be holding while the other person pours. You can also make this recipe, if you have a muffin tin, you can turn it into muffins and pour each one into its own individual container. All right. Final product looks like before we put it in the oven. I will cook mine for 45 minutes to an hour. At the 45-minute mark, I'll check it and see if it's beginning to look golden brown, if it's beginning to look ready. If it is, then I take it out and I'll stick like a knife, a fork, a toothpick, whatever you have on hand, stick it in the center or kind of your thickest parts. And when you pull it out, if it comes out clean, then it's done. If it's not clean, if it's still kind of sticky, then you know you have to keep it a little bit longer. Everyone's ovens vary, but at that hour mark, it should be done. It's in the oven. See you in 45 minutes. So our 45 minutes is up. I'm going to go ahead and take the bread out of the oven. It's looking good. Taking things out of the oven, especially after they're hot, it's a good thing to use oven mitts. I like this one because it almost has like a silicone grip on the back and then the place in the front for me to stick my hand. And it's Mickey Mouse.
So I don't have a toothpick to stick in here, but I do have a butter knife. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick it in the middle and then pull it out. It looks pretty clean. I'll put it in a few more places. The chocolate chips are going to be kind of melty, so those will definitely stain your fork a little bit or your knife a little bit, but it's looking done. It's coming out clean. There's some chocolate. All right, well, you can let it sit. I would recommend you let it sit for about 15 minutes, let it cool down, and then you can go ahead and cut it. And I would then let it cool even longer before you put it in the freezer, if you are going to put it in the freezer. If you're just going to serve it right away, if you're eating it on your own or eating with your friends, family, you can go ahead and just let it sit for 15 minutes. But if you are putting it in the freezer, I would let it cool for closer to an hour, hour and a half. You can also just feel the pan and make sure that you don't put a hot product into the freezer. Hope you enjoyed this video and hope you enjoy your pumpkin bread as much as I do. Have a great day. See you next time.